On this Friday night, unwavering uncertainty in China. Michael Spavor's trial ends without a verdict. What's Canada's next move?
It took a long time in Ottawa to understand that common sense would not work.
Ontario's troubling trend, younger patients with COVID in intensive care. Two unlikely allies team up to get a child killer into a maximum security prison.
They've totally left victims out in the shadows.
A Global News exclusive. And back on the front lines.
You can retire, but you can never stop being a nurse.
The remedy for a healthcare crunch.
Global National with Donna Friesen. Reporting tonight, Robin Gill.
Good evening and thank you for joining us. For 2 torturous years, Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig have been held in jail in China. Today, Spavor appeared in a Chinese courtroom on charges of spying, but there was no decision. And the Prime Minister has tough words for the closed-door proceedings.
Their arbitrary detention is completely unacceptable, as is the lack of transparency around these court proceedings.
The Chinese government fired back, pointing to the case of Meng Wanzhou, arguing the CFO of Huawei has been arbitrarily detained in Vancouver. Abigail Bimman has our top story tonight.
Starting in 10 minutes, and we don't have access yet.
Tense moments ahead of Michael Spavor's trial. News cameras pushed away, diplomats kept out. After 2 years behind bars, the espionage trial lasted 2 hours, with no verdict yet.
It remains unclear what has transpired in the courtroom, and we remain frustrated about that.
Close to a dozen international allies were there, and apparently Spavor caught a glimpse of their support.
He saw us. The lawyer said he saw us.
In a harshly worded statement from the Chinese embassy, Canada is labeled hypocritical and arrogant, and the Canadian claim the cases lack transparency is called, quote, fact distorting. The Prime Minister disagrees.
It is disappointing that the trial that Michael Spavor went through, and possibly the trial that Michael Kovrig will go through on Monday, is happening in secret, without transparency, without access.
Justin Trudeau says China needs to understand it's not just about 2 Canadians, but about its relationship with other countries, too. The trial coincides with the first meeting between the Biden administration and China in Alaska.
But I am very confident that this is an issue that will be raised.
One former Canadian ambassador to China says rallying international support has been the only part of Canada's strategy that's worked.
It took a long time in Ottawa to understand that common sense would not work. In fact, I think that Ottawa should have adopted a much firmer tone right from the outset, should also have taken measures to retaliate against China.
The family of Michael Spavor describes him as an ordinary businessman who has done extraordinary things to build ties between Canada, China, and Korea. Now they await a verdict, as the family of Michael Kovrig awaits his trial, scheduled for Monday in Beijing. Abigail Bimman, Global News, Ottawa.
Trudeau expects the fate of the 2 Michaels to come up today during high-level talks between China and the U.S. This is the Biden administration's first sit-down meeting with Chinese diplomats. And as Jennifer Johnson explains, their relationship is off to a frosty start.
In frigid Alaska, heated exchanges between top diplomats from the Biden administration and China. In their first face-to-face meeting, both sides took aim over the coronavirus, cyber attacks, unfair trade, and human rights abuses.
We got a defensive response, but we were also able to have a very candid conversation on Iran, on North Korea, on Afghanistan, on climate.
The Chinese are warning the U.S. to stay out of its internal affairs. They said the U.S. doesn't represent international opinions and criticized America's own human rights issues, including the, quote, slaughter of African Americans. The Biden administration slapped new sanctions on China the day before the meeting, quickly dispelling concerns it won't be as tough on China as former President Donald Trump.
What's your reaction to China last night?
I'm very proud of the Secretary of State.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken just met with Japan and South Korea's leaders, who also expressed concerns about China's heavy-handed tactics on activists and dissidents.
There are a number of areas where we are fundamentally at odds, including China's actions in Xinjiang, with regard to Hong Kong, Tibet, increasingly Taiwan.
Expectations were low for this meeting, but the White House describes it as a starting point after decades of tense relations between the world's two superpowers. Jennifer Johnson, Global News, Washington.
It's a big weekend for the country's official opposition. More than 3,000 Conservative delegates are taking part in a virtual convention. They've been debating policy and strategy to gear up for a potential federal election this year. But there are signs of frustration. Some members aren't keen on the direction of the party. Our chief political correspondent, David Akin, is keeping an eye on the convention. And David, it looks like Aaron O'Toole has his work cut out for him.
Well, that's right, Robin. And O'Toole just gave a speech at this convention where he looks to get past all that grumbling. It was a speech where the objective was not just to unite Conservatives, but also to appeal to the broader general electorate, to those who may not have voted Conservative since Stephen Harper won his only majority 10 years ago.
We must present new ideas, not make the same arguments, hoping that maybe this time more Canadians will come around to our position.
If we are to have a general election this spring, this may be the first campaign speech. The Conservative leader pitching for support he'll need to defeat Justin Trudeau.
The Conservative Party can defeat him, but only with the courage to grow.
And that's the key message. Find those voters who have not voted Conservative in more than a decade. There are still many missing details to O'Toole's plan, but he sketched out some broad strokes, including what the Conservatives call their Canada Recovery Plan.
We are the party that will ensure Canada has a real plan for reopening and rebuilding our economy, a real plan to get life back to normal.
He also promised a more credible plan for climate change and the environment, but details will come later, though he did vow an O'Toole government would repeal the Trudeau government's carbon tax.
We will scrap Justin Trudeau's carbon tax on working Canadians.
He also promised there will be consequences for MPs, like Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who break conflict of interest laws multiple times.
We will toughen the Conflict of Interest Act and the Lobbying Act and impose higher penalties to end abuse by Liberal insiders.
Now, going into this weekend's convention, we have multiple polls showing Conservative support has been softening, dropping under 30%. So Conservatives are hoping that O'Toole's campaign speech this evening begins to reverse that trend. Robin?
David Akin in Ottawa. Thanks, David. Canada's top doctor says an increase in the more transmissible COVID-19 variants is threatening the progress being made by vaccines. New daily cases across Canada rose by 8% over the past week. At least 4,500 variant cases have now been confirmed. In some parts of the country, they make up most of the new cases.
At this point, Team Variant has the ability to take off fast. This is a crucial moment. If we don't slow down the spread of the variants, Team Vaccine is at risk of falling behind.
Health authorities believe the variants could be behind a recent uptick in severe cases across the country. As Eric Sorensen reports, there is a concerning shift in who's at risk.
Almost 10% of Canadians have now received a first shot, but vaccines are playing catch-up. COVID variants are amplifying the pandemic. And another curveball? Younger adults are getting hit harder than expected. Ontario has seen a spate of cases as the variants spread.
Well, we are seeing that the variants of concern are striking more younger people. If the variants of concern increase exponentially, we're going to need to have medicine beds, we're going to need to have more intensive care beds, more ventilators, but we're ready for that.
Readiness includes a field hospital outside one health centre in Toronto if a third wave takes hold. Hospitalizations in Ontario rose dramatically in early January, fell just as rapidly until mid-February. Now the numbers have begun to climb. And the need for intensive care beds also peaked in January, then dropped off, but have risen again to more than 300 ICU beds now in use. And it's not just older patients who need them, says one ER physician.
That's really what we're feeling right now is patients in their 40s to 60s who are sick with COVID, whose oxygen saturations are low, who need to be admitted, and some of whom need to be admitted to the ICU.
One explanation for a growing number of serious cases among younger adults, older Canadians are increasingly protected by vaccines.
If you have less older people being susceptible because they're vaccinated, you have a larger proportion of healthy working people, younger people being exposed.
In any event, COVID variants are throwing a wrench into plans to normalize life in this country until vaccines in bigger numbers can come to the rescue.
The vaccine, I think, will contribute to decelerating the epidemic, but it's not going to do it yet.
The public health advice for now, social distance a while longer. And that includes saying no to big gatherings at Easter. Eric Sorensen, Global News, Toronto.
And there are fears those variants could fuel a third wave of infections in First Nations communities. So the military is being called in to get more shots into arms.
My department and the Canadian Armed Forces will begin supporting an unparalleled accelerated vaccination program in a number of isolated First Nation communities, as well as a select number of larger Indigenous communities starting in Manitoba.
The initial deployment will include up to 23 different communities in northern Manitoba. Two unlikely allies are joining forces. Coming up in a Global News exclusive, their mission to move a murderer back to maximum security. Plus, rodents running rampant when mice aren't so nice. These critters will give you the jitters. A mice plague is running rampant in rural Australia, infesting just about everything, from crops to kitchen cupboards. A bumper harvest is serving as a buffet for these mice, and hay bales being stored for winter have been destroyed. The rodents even got into hospitals and bit at least 3 patients. Experts say the population of these pests boomed after unusually heavy summer rains. The story of Tori Stafford is one Canadians will never forget. The 8-year-old from Woodstock, Ontario, was murdered by Michael Rafferty and Terry Lynn McClintock in April of 2009. Tori's killers have both been moved to lower security facilities over the course of their sentences, and learning of each transfer is painful for Tori's family. Rodney Stafford, Tori's father, has found a surprising ally in his fight to get his daughter's killer into a maximum security prison. Mark Carcassol explains.
Convicted in the killing of 8-year-old Tori Stafford, Michael Rafferty is serving a life sentence with no chance of parole for 25 years. He's currently at a medium security facility in Quebec. Rodney Stafford, Tori's father, says he was not informed till months after Rafferty was transferred out of a maximum security facility.
And they've totally left victims out in the shadows.
The public safety minister at the time insisted Rafferty's new facility specializes in dealing with sex offenders, but that didn't sit well with Rodney. Speaking on condition of anonymity, a relative of Rafferty stepped forward to try to help get Rafferty back into maximum security, claiming the convicted killer had been extorting money from his mother.
He had been reaching out to his mother on a regular basis and sort of, getting money sent to him and sent to what seems to be inmates' spouses, claiming that he was fearful of his life, that he had owed people.
This relative does not believe Rafferty was really in constant danger in prison, but that he was just manipulating his mom to help pay other prisoners back, allegedly for things as basic as junk food from the canteen. He provided us with a folder filled with copies of checks and money order receipts to people mostly in Quebec, but as far away as BC. Rafferty's mom lived in Ontario.
Who are these people? I honestly don't know who they are. We've got boxes and boxes of them, but there's probably the equivalent of $30,000 worth of money that is sent through to other people out there.
Just here, so this isn't even it?
That's not all of it, no.
We contacted several of the people listed on those documents. None would corroborate this relative's claims. We reached out to Rafferty. He also refused comment. Rafferty's relative says the family repeatedly asked Corrections Canada to stop Rafferty's calls to no avail, and that he emailed back and forth with officials for most of 2019, sending them details and copies of those receipts.
And we have yet to hear anything further from that.
Corrections Canada tells Global News it does review information about inmates brought to their attention from both victims and families, but that citing the Privacy Act, it can't comment on Rafferty's case. Michael Rafferty's mother, Deborah Murphy, died of a heart attack in 2018 at the age of 60. This relative holds Rafferty personally responsible.
The stress of the constant phone calls and the struggle financially to try and keep supporting him in prison was just too much for her.
Rafferty's relative hopes sharing their story will reopen the conversation about Rafferty's move to medium security in solidarity with Tory Stafford's family.
To know that his family is willing to make those steps as well to do what's right in this case, I couldn't appreciate it anymore.
Mark Carcassole, Global News, Toronto.
Barriers to vaccination still ahead, the essential workers who may not get their shots.
You're watching Global National.
One of the most important tools to protect people against COVID-19 is the vaccine. As provinces ramp up their rollouts, advocates are raising concerns about some essential workers being excluded because of their immigration status. There are about 1.6 million migrants, refugees, and undocumented people in Canada. Many of them are in industries at high risk of exposure, working long hours with low pay. But as Krista Hesse reports, they're facing huge barriers to get vaccinated.
Lily has risked her life working on the front lines in one of the most dangerous settings for COVID-19 deaths in the country, long-term care homes. She should have been one of the first people to receive the vaccine.
We are on the front lines every day like everybody else, and still we are being barred. Still.
In January, Lily's employer sent an email asking staff for their provincial health card in order to get it, something she does not have. We're not using her real name. She's undocumented, and she fears she could be deported.
It's something that plays on your mind every single day that you could be found out.
Despite assurances from federal and provincial governments that the vaccine will be available to everyone, regardless of status, advocates say the reality on the ground is quite different. Even though provinces have laws governing consent and the sharing of health data, for undocumented people, the fear of personal information being shared with border services and possible deportation is too great. Karen Koch from the Migrant Rights Network says they're already seeing people struggle with access.
So unless those concrete measures are taken to ensure in practice that everyone has access, the policy won't matter.
This deeply ingrained fear could mean the 500,000 undocumented people in Canada don't receive vaccines.
If you don't treat everyone in your community and it's a pandemic, you treat no one. Everyone is at risk.
Global News reached out to the Ministries of Health in Ontario, British Columbia, and Quebec, provinces that have large numbers of migrants and undocumented people. All provinces said a health card will not be required to get the vaccine, but they do require information such as a full name, date of birth, and address.
That level of identification would keep them away.
The Migrant Rights Network says granting people permanent status would solve a lot of these problems.
Permanent residency is what's going to give people access to the same rights and protections as everybody else.
Colford says he's frustrated by the lack of action from the federal government.
After all these years, they've still continued to let these people fend for themselves and be lost.
Krista Hesse, Global News.
Tomorrow on The New Reality, Krista will take a deeper look at the medical volunteers trying to provide care for undocumented patients turned away from hospital or told to pay for treatment. That's Saturday night at 7 p.m. right here on Global. Up next, the Canadians putting retirement on hold to help out on the front lines. Some Canadians are putting retirement on pause to join the fight against COVID-19. Thousands of doctors, nurses, and other health professionals have already spent long careers caring for the sick and will now serve as critical reinforcements for Canada's mass immunization effort. Karen Lieberman shares their stories.
As vaccine supply ramps up across the country, the number of vaccination clinics is growing.
And I do need permission to give you this vaccine. Can I have your consent, please?
Heeding the call to help.
You can retire, but you can never stop being a nurse.
A not so fresh crop of health professionals rejoining the workforce. 45 years in nursing was not enough for Lorraine Gonzalez. She now spends 12 hours a day at this vaccine clinic.
I just felt that I had something more to give, so when they said, "Can you come back and vaccinate?" I thought, yes.
Returning as a reinforcement on the front line was a no-brainer for this general surgeon.
It's extremely satisfying, particularly with the patient population we're dealing with now in the over 80s. These are remarkable people.
even though he only just retired 3 months ago.
It didn't work out so well, did it? No.
Last spring, the Registered Nurses Association of Ontario reached out to past members.
We acted right away with VNNers, and we got, I think, over 10,000 nurses, not all retired, that were willing to go to ICU, to vaccination, to case and contact tracing, you name it.
You still gotta wash your hands.
Jane Cornelius, a former ICU manager, has come out of retirement twice.
In April, they asked me to come back and help, and then I went back into retirement because things settled down, and now with vaccination, they've asked us to come back and help.
Common among these retirees is their eagerness to pitch in.
People needed help, and that's what family doctors do, is they jump in there and help whenever help is needed.
The way out of this pandemic, she says, is to get everybody vaccinated. Until then, retirement is put on pause.
I'm hoping by September that I'm flying off somewhere nice and warm.
Time on the golf course. the things you should be doing when you're retired.
Karen Lieberman, Global News, Toronto.
And that is Global National for this Friday night. I'm Robin Gill. Tonight, Your Canada is a view of the Port Mann Bridge from Coquitlam, BC. We'd love to see your corner of this country, so please keep sending your photos to viewers@globalnational.com. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you back here tomorrow. Have a great night.